Capitan Tiago was unusually cheerful, considering the chaos engulfing the country. In the midst of political arrests and unrest, he had been spared. Unlike many others, no one had taken any notice of him. He wasn't thrown into prison, subjected to solitary confinement, or tortured in the state dungeons, which were infamous for their cruel methods. As rumors spread of Ibarra's imminent trial, many of Tiago's former friends had been taken away for their supposed involvement in seditious activities. However, to his relief, they were soon released by the Captain General, who found them unworthy of further imprisonment. Their absence had been a sort of vacation from political pressures, but now life seemed to return to normal for Capitan Tiago. Capitan Tinong, another man of wealth, had not been as fortunate. His experience in the dungeons had left him pale and silent. His family rejoiced at his return, though he was not the same man as before. He never ventured out of his house, terrified of associating with anyone the government might consider a rebel. Not even Don Primitivo, the man who claimed to have the wisdom of the ancients, could get him to speak. "Creed, prime," Don Primitivo would say. "You're fortunate I burned your papers when I did. If I hadn't, they might have taken your life." Gratias agamus domino Deo. Let's be thankful you're not in the Marianas Islands planting sweet potatoes. Capitan Tiago was aware of what had happened to Tinong. In fact, his fears were similar. The rumors surrounding the possible arrest and execution of Ibarra didn't bother him, though. Tiago felt a deep sense of gratitude for his safety, unsure whether to attribute it to divine intervention or his political connections. Aunt Isabel, Tiago's sister-in-law, was certain it was the Virgin of Antipolo who had saved them. "It's either her," Isabel would say, "or maybe the Virgin of the Rosary, though it could be the Virgin of Carmen. In any case, no lower than Our Lady of the Girdle." She credited every virgin she knew of for the family's continued safety. Tiago, however, preferred to attribute their fortune to more earthly matters. "It's probably true, Isabel," he would say, "but it wasn't the Virgin of Antipolo alone. My friends have helped us too. And don't forget Linares, my future son-in-law. He's rubbed shoulders with important people, even Señor Antonio Canovas, the premier in Spain." He couldn't help but smile every time he heard news that Ibarra's case was progressing toward a dire end. Meanwhile, gossip swirled about the townspeople and María Clara, Capitan Tiago's only daughter. Rumors spread that Ibarra would soon be hanged. Others said he would be deported. Tiago paid little attention to the specifics. All that mattered to him was ensuring that María Clara married Linares as soon as possible. After all, Linares had connections, and Tiago knew that these would secure his position in society. It was in the middle of these discussions that Doña Victorina, Don Tiburcio, and Linares arrived. Doña Victorina, always eager to display her supposed status, led the conversation. She wore her usual flamboyant attire, and her pretentious manner filled the room. "Yes, of course," she said with her adopted Andalusian accent. "We've come to discuss important matters regarding María Clara. It's time she makes a smart marriage, right, Tiburcio?" Don Tiburcio, her beleaguered husband, nodded, though he had little choice in the matter. Yes, he stammered. Linares, meanwhile, remained silent, though his demeanor exuded pride. He was not only the designated heir to Capitan Tiago's wealth, but also a man who now had direct access to the Captain General. María Clara entered the room, looking pale and frail after her illness. Her long hair, once admired by many, was now tied loosely with a silk ribbon. She moved with an air of sadness, her eyes downcast, as she went to Doña Victorina to kiss her hand. "Good evening, señora," she said softly. Victorina looked her over with sharp eyes. "Ah, Clarita, so pale, so frail." She turned to Capitan Tiago, saying, "We must speed up the wedding. Let's not wait too long. Linares here is a man of stature. He will take good care of her." María Clara forced a smile, her heart heavy. She knew that this marriage was a decision made for her. It was not something she had wanted or asked for. Her mind wandered to Ibarra, the man she once loved, now in prison, awaiting an uncertain fate. As the conversation shifted to details of the wedding, María Clara excused herself, retreating to her room under the pretense of needing rest. Her aunt, Isabel, looked at her niece with concern. "She hasn't been the same since her illness," Isabel murmured to herself, but Tiago didn't seem to notice. He was too engrossed in discussing the grand feast they would hold to celebrate María Clara's upcoming wedding to Linares. The next evening, Capitan Tiago's house was filled with guests, mainly Spaniards and Chinese, a reflection of his desire to align himself with the ruling class. The atmosphere was festive, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. While the guests engaged in casual conversation, María Clara sat silently in a corner, arranging flowers on a tray. Her hands trembled as she worked, and her eyes remained distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Among the men, talk of recent political events dominated the discussion. Padre Salvi, ever the quiet observer, stood at a distance, listening intently but saying little. Meanwhile, the new major, a man who had once been an alferez, boasted about his recent promotion and the battles he had fought against the rebels. "I've heard rumors that Ibarra will be deported," one of the government officials remarked. "Deported?" echoed another. "Nothing more? He deserves to be hanged like the rebels of '72. The old lieutenant, Senor Guevara, shook his head. "He's not as guilty as you think," he said gravely. "If he had been more careful with whom he trusted, if he had been less open, perhaps he wouldn't be in this situation." "What do you mean?" asked one of the friars. Guevara's eyes darkened as he replied, "There was a letter written to a woman before Ibarra left for Europe. It contained some ambiguous lines that the prosecutor interpreted as a threat against the government. That letter was his downfall." "Who was the woman?" asked another friar. His curiosity piqued. Guevara glanced toward Padre Salvi but did not answer. Instead, he walked away, his face set in a grim expression. María Clara, who had overheard the conversation, felt her heart sink. She knew which letter they were referring to, and the weight of guilt pressed down on her. Later that night, when the guests had left and the house had grown quiet, María Clara retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. She fell to her knees at the foot of a small image of the Virgin Mary, sobbing uncontrollably. "Mother, Mother, forgive me," she whispered through her tears. As the hours passed, the house fell into silence. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting eerie shadows on the floor. María Clara, her face streaked with tears, stood up and walked out onto the azotea, the rooftop terrace. She gazed out at the river, her heart heavy with despair. The faint sound of a small banca approaching the house reached her ears, but she barely noticed. It wasn't until she heard footsteps that she turned around. Standing before her was a figure she hadn't expected to see, Crisostomo Ibarra. He had escaped, and there he stood, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and anger. "Crisostomo," María Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. You're alive." "Yes, Maria," Ibarra replied, his tone cold. "I'm alive, thanks to Elias. He saved me from the prison where my friends had abandoned me. I've come to say goodbye, to tell you that I forgive you." María Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Crisostomo, you don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want this. I never wanted to betray you." Ibarra shook his head, his expression bitter. "You gave them my letter. That was enough to destroy me." "No!" María Clara cried, stepping closer to him. "I did it to save my father, to save my family. I had no choice." Ibarra looked at her, his anger softening. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of the decision she had made. "Maria," he said softly, "we were meant to be happy together. But now, everything is lost." María Clara shook her head. "Not everything," she whispered. "You must leave Crisostomo. You must go far away from here. Start a new life." "And you?" Ibarra asked. "What will become of you?" María Clara turned away, her heart breaking. "I will live the life they have chosen for me," she said. "But I will always love you, Crisostomo, no matter what happens. Ibarra reached out and gently took her hand. "Goodbye, Maria," he whispered. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the night. María Clara stood alone on the azotea, watching as Ibarra's boat drifted away into the darkness. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that the man she loved was gone forever.